Welcome to session 6 of the Gifts Compass certification training in Jung's psychological types. The first 5 sessions of this course dealt with psychological types in consciousness. With this session, we move to the deeper applications of Jung's type model and consider the attitudes of the unconscious. Oppositions are an essential element of Jung's model. In this session, we will consider the various forms the type oppositions take. We will also consider what happens if an individual overly identifies with conscious type dispositions and the types of neuroses that excessive one-sidedness can engender. The film for this session is The Hours, a film that depicts excessive one-sidedness, shadow and soul projections, and what Jung called the knockdown battle of oppositions encountered in life. In chapter 10 of Psychological Types, Jung noted, "It may perhaps seem odd that I should speak of an attitude of the unconscious. As I have repeatedly indicated, I regard the attitude of the unconscious as compensatory to consciousness. According to this view, the unconscious has as good a claim to an attitude as the latter." So in this session, we will consider type dynamics. That is the nature of the oppositions that could occur, their compensatory value, and the destructive character of the unconscious should the lead types gain too great an ascendancy. Two of the more common manifestations of shadow or soul dispositions occur in the form of projections. The shadow could be cast, usually negatively, onto someone else, or anima or animus projections may occur where the soul's type dispositions resonate with someone else. In the 1925 seminars, Jung reviewed the sort of oppositions and alliances that occur among the functions in the process of integrating the opposites. In the diagram on the left, a lead thinking function would be theoretically opposed by a feeling function in the shadow. Each of these functions recruits an auxiliary. In this case, feeling recruits intuition and thinking recruits sensation. The dynamics occurring between the opposing auxiliaries is less conflictive, and Jung says could be addressed in a therapeutic setting. Jung notes that the oppositions between lead and shadow is a knockdown battle that occurs in life. The diagram on the right depicts the oppositions where the functions have joined a directional attitude and form type oppositions rather than functional oppositions. Extroverted thinking, for example, versus introverted feeling. Extroverted thinking is aided by extroverted sensation. Introverted feeling is aided by introverted intuition. A review of the theoretical oppositions can provide a feel for the intensity of the knockdown battle occurring in life. In this illustration, extroverted thinking and introverted feeling are opposed. Either could be in the lead. Note that whichever would be in the shadow would have a less developed, infantile, or primitive character. So, in terms of orientation, extroverted thinking has an extensive order, introverted feeling, intensive ideals. The composite attitude, perceive order versus apprehend ideals. The new functional role, constructive thinking versus idealistic feeling. The substance of the type, outer thoughts versus inner valuations. The scope to a particular order versus to holistic ideals. In the film, The Hours, consider the scene at the train station where Virginia and Leonard are in their own knockdown battle. They could be depicting the sort of psychic battle occurring within an individual between these two type dispositions, introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. Consider the conflict within an individual like Carl Jung, who had introverted thinking in the lead and extroverted feeling in the shadow. His oppositions were extensive norms in the shadow intensive insights in the lead. Perceiving norms versus apprehending insights. Social feeling versus conceptual thinking. Outer evaluations versus inner thoughts. Particular norms versus holistic insights. In the first half of life for Jung, the lead clearly won that battle. But in the second half of life, the shadow seeks and usually gains greater integration. If you know his biography, do you see ways that the shadow might have found pathways to integration in the second half of his life? Extroverted sensation and introverted intuition also have distinct oppositions. In orientation to extensive facts versus intensive images, perceiving facts versus apprehending those images. The new functional role, realistic sensation versus visionary intuition. The substance of outer perceptions versus inner imagination. The scope to particular facts versus holistic images. For the two crossover types, the conflicts are less distinct. They do not make worthy opponents and are often found collaborating. Think of the way that these oppositions were cooperatively at work in the lives of Steve Jobs or Coco Chanel, for example. They had the ability to anticipate opportunities in the market as well as a finely tuned aesthetic sensibility. The commingled images of the collective unconscious render these particular oppositions less antagonistic. Extensive possibilities versus intensive innervations. Perceiving possibilities versus apprehending innervations. Catalytic intuition versus aesthetic sensation. Outer imagination versus inner perceptions. Particular possibilities, which were particular but also holistic versus holistic innervations. These two are not especially conflictive. So in practice, we often find that a rational type is the opposing type for either of these two receptive types. The psyche seeks wholeness, not one-sidedness, and compensatory energies are at work to reduce one-sidedness. If the one-sidedness is excessive, a person's life can get caught up in self-defeating impulses that Jung considered forms of neurosis. The shadow oppositions play their parts in the neurosis. Introverted attitudes in the shadow often oppose extroverted attitudes in consciousness and can adopt highly destructive attributes. No longer the kitten of a meek, inferior type, they become the wily and ferocious tiger of destructive oppositions. Or as Jung says, it is an outstanding peculiarity of unconscious impulses that, when deprived of energy by lack of conscious recognition, they take on a destructive character. And this happens as soon as they cease to be compensatory. Jung generally characterized the neurosis engendered by extroverted one-sidedness as hysteria. An exaggerated rapport with persons, exaggerated uncontrolled excitement, or imitation that may culminate in a nervous breakdown. The descriptions on the screen depict the sort of neurotic attributes that Jung associated with an excessive identification with the extroverted types. For extreme extroverted thinking, some of the terms that characterize the neurotic condition include denigrates critics, withdraws sympathy, demolishes opposition, sharp in tone, acrimonious, aggressive. Insinuations multiply, feelings have a sultry and resentful character, always the mark of the inferior function. Extreme extroverted feeling, nothing but dismissive thinking, extravagant displays of feeling, gushing, loud expostulations that ring hollow, unmanageable fears and emotional excesses. Extreme extroverted sensation, a pathological parody of imagined troubles, jealous, suspicious fantasies, petty, sanctimonious, a grotesquely punctilious morality, pettifogging captiousness, extreme extroverted intuition, poorly considered pursuits of new possibilities, claims of freedom from restraint and rational judgment, attacked from within by neurotic compulsions, over-subtle ratiocinations, hair-splitting dialectics, and a compulsive tie to the sensation aroused by objects, compulsive hypochondriacal ideas, phobias, and every imaginable kind of absurd bodily sensation. He characterized the neurosis engendered by extreme introverted one-sidedness as psychasthenia, characterized by excessive fear, anxiety, phobias, obsessions, compulsions, and fatigue. Extreme introverted thinking. There is an obsessive tie to the unimportant. Will lose social bearings, reckless value judgments, isolated and temperamental, touchy. He will burst out with vicious personal retorts against every criticism, becomes destructive and embittered. Extreme introverted feeling. People are imagined to be thinking malignant thoughts, suspicious, combative, lofty ideas and admirable people demeaned with nothing but thinking, will stop at nothing to defeat perceived enemies. Extreme introverted sensation. Isolated and alienated, nothing but thinking or picky and fault-finding feeling, or with intuition in the shadow, sees dangerous possibilities lurking in the background. For extreme introverted intuition, obsessive about minute facts and details, hypochondria, compulsive tie to objects, aloof and incomprehensible. This is a table for your reference that depicts the various attributes of the types. Their new functional role, orientation and focus, their attributes under normal and extreme conditions, as shadow oppositions, both undeveloped and destructive, and as projections, both positive soul projections and as negative shadow projections. So this is a great deal of information to take in. For this table to be meaningful, it needs to be reviewed one GCI profile at a time, considering both lead and shadow dispositions and how they may be showing up in a person's life. Type dynamics are most readily remembered when they are associated with an individual and the individual's biography. The film The Hours is an excellent one for illustrating psychic oppositions as represented by characters in the film. Virginia and Leonard, Clarissa and Richard, Laura Brown and Dan, Virginia and her sister Vanessa. They are opposites in many ways. We could also see the way types can serve as effective collaborators. Virginia and Laura might have each understood one another well, had intimate conversations. Clarissa and Vanessa might have thrown a splendid dinner party. Leonard and Dan could have had a good time watching a soccer game together. The film is rich in its array of typological orientations. It also illustrates pathologies. People in this film are stuck. The integration of the opposites is not proceeding well. People are suffering. Note that the gifts compass diagram is structured to illustrate the oppositions just reviewed. The classical type oppositions are depicted opposite one another on the compass. Extroverted thinking versus introverted feeling. Extroverted feeling versus introverted thinking. Extroverted sensation versus introverted intuition. This particular compass is intended to illustrate the profile for young man Carl Jung. Early in his life, he acknowledged that extroverted feeling and extroverted sensation were in his shadow. So in this session, we've begun our venture into understanding type dynamics, not just collaborations in consciousness, but also collaborations and oppositions in the unconscious. Type dynamics will be more complex, but if you have a working feel for oppositions and collaborations, you will be using Jung's type compass as he did. He wrote, "I would not for anything dispense with this compass on my psychological voyages of discovery."